At 1 minute past 7 on Friday evening, tens of millions of phones across England and Wales screamed at exactly the same moment. Not a text message, not a news notification. The siren, the one the British government built for the situations where something close to you might kill you. Live radio studios collapsed into a wall of noise as every handset in the room went off at once. Presenters stopped mid-sentence. In cars, in pubs, on trains, on garden benches, in the last of the evening heat, people looked down at a message telling them there was a very high risk of wildfires nationally and that even a small flame could take homes, businesses, and lives. Britain, the country that keeps a raincoat in the car boot in July, the island whose entire personality is drizzle, moss, and a national conversation about whether it might brighten up later. That country just made the widest use of its emergency alert system it has ever made for a live, unfolding emergency. And the emergency was fire. 24 hours before that siren went off, a man in the West Midlands town of Stourbridge heard someone scream. He looked toward the railway line at the bottom of his garden and later told Reuters that the trees along the railway track were exploding. Not catching alight, exploding. He grabbed what he could and his family ran. 19 homes on that edge of town no longer exist. And here is the detail that turns one terrible afternoon into a much bigger story, the detail almost nobody is leading with. The day those houses burned was not a record-breaking day in Britain. Not for August. Not for the country. The temperature everybody is quoting is not the reason this happened, and once you understand what actually is the reason, you will look at that green little island differently. If you want disaster coverage that keeps the drama and keeps the facts straight at the same time, subscribe. That balance is the entire job of this channel, and this story is a good example of why it matters. Start with the number everyone fixated on, because it is the one thing the headlines agreed on. On Thursday, the 13th of August, the Met Office recorded 38.1 degrees Celsius at Kew Gardens in West London. In Fahrenheit, that is 100.6 degrees. Think about what that means in the most physical way possible. Your own body runs at about 37 degrees Celsius. The air in London that afternoon was hotter than the blood moving under your skin. Your body could not shed heat into it. It could only sweat and hope. That reading made it the hottest day of the year in the United Kingdom and the 5th hottest day the country has ever recorded. Pershore in Worcestershire hit 38 degrees. 40 separate locations across central and southern England climbed past 36. Now here is where the honest version and the viral version separate. 38.1 did not break the British record for August. That record still belongs to Faversham in Kent, which reached 38.5 degrees back on the 10th of August, 2003. 23 years ago, and still standing. And 38.1 is nowhere near the all-time British record of 40.3 degrees, set in Lincolnshire in July, 2022. So if the temperature was not a record, why is the country burning at a level it has never burned at before? Because heat is not the fuel. Heat is only the match. The fuel was assembled over the preceding 4 months, quietly, in a way that produced no dramatic footage at all, and that is the part of this story that got skipped. England has just come through its driest July since records began. Not the driest in a decade, the driest ever measured. The country received about 10% of its long-term average rainfall for the month. For every 10 buckets of rain England normally expects in July, it got one. In southeast England, the figure was close to 1% of average. Even in the wet northwest, the part of the country that jokes about permanent rain, it was 26%. And July was not an isolated month. It was the middle of a sequence. The heat that ended in those burning gardens started in spring. Britain's first heat wave of the year arrived in May, which is early enough to be strange on its own, and it did not arrive gently. On the 25th of May, Kew Gardens reached 34.8 degrees Celsius, breaking the British record for the hottest May day. The previous record had stood since 1922. It was not broken by 1/10 of a degree, the way records usually fall. It was beaten by 2 full degrees, which in climate records is the equivalent of a sprinter taking half a second off a world 100-meter time. The next day it was broken again at 35.1. Then came another heat wave, then another, then another. The heat that peaked last Thursday was the 5th of the summer, and the statistics behind it are worth hearing as a group rather than one at a time. 2026 has produced more days at or above 36 degrees than any year in the British record. At 4, it has produced more days at or above 37. At 3, and it has now matched 2022 for the number of days reaching 38 degrees at 2. Only one other year in British history has hit 38 twice. Summer 2025 was already the hottest Britain has measured since records began in 1884. This summer is on course to take that title from it 1 year later. Each of those heat waves did the same thing to the ground. It pulled water out of the soil, out of the grass, out of the leaf litter, and none of it came back because the rain never arrived between them. By early August, England had gone 7 consecutive weeks with less than 10 millimeters of rain. Across nearly 2 months, the whole country received less water than you would find in the bottom of a shallow saucer. The consequences stacked up in every reservoir and every river. Reservoir storage across England fell to 69%, nearly 12 percentage points below where it should be at this time of year, with 5 reservoirs classed as exceptionally low. On the 10th of August, the National Drought Group reported that 71.3% of England was officially in drought. Government figures put roughly 45 million people inside drought-affected areas, and about 27 million living under formal water restrictions. 9 separate water companies have imposed temporary use bans, the widest set of restrictions the country has seen since 2022. Farmers are being squeezed on top of that. There are more than 1,500 restrictions on abstraction licenses, and in East Anglia, the Environment Agency has told about 300 abstractors they must cut what they take by half. Read those numbers as one sentence, and the picture snaps into focus. The English landscape in August of 2026 is not a green country having a hot week. It is a dried-out country waiting for a spark. And here is a fact that stops the debate about whether this is a fluke. England has now been in drought 3 times in 5 years, 2022, 2025, and now the heat everyone photographed was the last day of a process that had been running since spring. And that process built something Britain has never really had before in the quantity it has now. A nation-sized wick, not forests, mostly. Thin, dead, sun-bleached grass, gorse, and bracken, threading between motorways and back gardens and railway lines and market towns, connecting everything to everything. So now the record that matters, not the thermometer, the count. Phil Garrigan, the chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council, told Reuters that the number of wildfires in England and Wales has now passed 1,017. That figure is not a target or a projection. That was the total for the whole of last year, and last year was itself the worst year ever recorded, beating 2022. Spread 1,017 fires evenly across a calendar year, and you get one wildfire starting somewhere in England or Wales roughly every 9 hours, day and night, all year. Britain has reached that same total by the middle of August, with the fire season running potentially all the way into November. Garrigan was explicit about what he expects. Not just a record-breaking year, but a large increase on anything previously experienced. Then he said the thing that should worry people more than any temperature. In a single 24-hour period, fire services declared 11 major incidents. The requests for support, in his words, had outstripped what the United Kingdom Fire and Rescue Service could supply. Crews were being asked for in more places than crews existed. The satellite record backs the ground reports. The European Forest Fire Information System has mapped around 75 separate British fires larger than 30 hectares this year, with a burned area of roughly 24,600 hectares. That is about 247 square kilometers of scorched ground. Lay it out in one piece and it would cover more than twice the footprint of the city of Manchester. Which brings us back to that street in Stourbridge, and to what a British wildfire looks like when it stops being a countryside problem. The fire began in tinder-dry fields on the edge of town. It did not stay there. It moved into a golf course, then into the gardens behind it, then into the houses themselves. 19 homes were destroyed. Another 18 were damaged. West Midlands Ambulance Service treated 54 people across the region, and 19 of them were taken to hospital. 6 firefighters ended up in hospital themselves, with smoke inhalation and heat exhaustion, because you cannot fight fire in that kind of heat without the heat fighting back. Residents had minutes, not hours. Town hall staff spent the following day sorting donated clothes for families who left with nothing but what was in their hands. And in Golden Hill, in Stoke-on-Trent, a separate fire took 4 more homes. In that case, 2 people, a man of 23 and a woman of 24, were arrested on suspicion of arson. I want to flag that carefully because it matters for how you read this whole story. An arrest is not a conviction, and the causes of the great majority of these fires have not been established at all. Now, that phrase from the man in Stourbridge, exploding trees, it sounds like the kind of thing that gets exaggerated in the retelling. It is not. It is a description of a real physical process, and it explains why British fire crews are being overwhelmed by fires in a landscape that used to be considered fireproof. A living tree in a normal British summer is mostly water. It is, in fire terms, a wet sponge standing in your way. Now take that tree through the driest July on record and 4 heat waves, the soil moisture it draws on is gone. The fine material, the leaves, the needles, the small twigs, the dead grass tangled around the base, dries down toward the moisture content of keyline dried timber. When a fire front approaches, it does not touch that tree first. It cooks it. Radiant heat pushes ahead of the flames, drives out the last moisture, and heats the plant material until it starts giving off flammable gases. Those gases build up inside and around the crown. Then, all at once, they find enough temperature and enough oxygen, and the entire crown ignites in a single event rather than burning gradually upward. To a person watching from 40 meters away, that is a bang, a flash, and a tree that has gone from green to a torch between one blink and the next. Gorse and conifers do it fastest because they carry volatile oils and resins. A line of gorse along a railway embankment is not a hedge in these conditions. It is a fuse, and that is how a grass fire crosses a road, a garden fence, and a British planning assumption in about 90 seconds. Each of those flash ignitions throws burning fragments downwind. Those embers land on dry grass, on decking, on a shed roof, in a gutter full of dead leaves that has not seen rain in 7 weeks. A house does not usually catch because a wall of flame arrives at the front door. It catches because 100 small burning pieces arrive first, and one of them lands somewhere that will hold it. Stourbridge was the story that made the national news, but it was one of many that day, and this is where the scale of what is happening becomes hard to ignore. In Wales, a wildfire that started in the Randermwen area near the market town of Llandovery on Wednesday, the 12th of August, had grown to around 250 hectares by Thursday. That is roughly 350 football pitches of burning upland. Mid and West Wales Fire and Rescue Service declared a major incident, citing the scale, complexity, and potential impact. Homes were evacuated. A rest center opened in a leisure center. Crews were still there on Saturday, describing it as a challenging and dynamic incident, which is the careful institutional way of saying it is not finished with us yet. South Wales declared its own major incident, with fires around Blaenavon and Porth, and residents pushed out of their homes in Ferndale. In Hampshire, firefighters were on the 6th straight day of a wildfire in the New Forest that broke out on Sunday, the 9th of August, burning through internationally important heathland where conservation groups warn recovery could take years. In Norfolk, the fire service dealt with 16 emergencies in a single Thursday afternoon, including a blaze on Mousehold Heath in Norwich. The Fire Brigades Union counted major wildfires in Nottinghamshire, Hampshire, South Wales, and Suffolk inside 48 hours. And none of this started in August. The British fire year opened in spring. In late April, a large wildfire broke out in the Mourne Mountains near Newcastle in Northern Ireland and burned around 1,000 hectares before 80 firefighters brought it under control. 2 days later, another one started in the same range near Hilltown and reached about 1,500 hectares. At one point, crews were working a fire front 600 meters wide, which is longer than 5 football pitches laid end to end, in terrain where you cannot simply drive a fire engine to the flames. The infrastructure took its own beating alongside the landscape. A major motorway was temporarily closed. Rail services were suspended in several regions, both by fires burning directly alongside the tracks and by the heat itself, and 2 trains derailed during the heat wave, prompting a Network Rail executive to say extra funding may be needed to help the railway cope with a changing climate. That is worth pausing on, because railway embankments are one of the most efficient fire corridors in the country. They are long, they are dry, they are lined with gorse and scrub, they run directly past the back gardens of millions of homes, and they carry sparks. The man in Stourbridge was not watching random woodland ignite. He was watching a fire corridor do exactly what a fire corridor does. Then came the response that tells you how far outside normal this had gone. The military was deployed. 100 Armed Forces personnel went initially to South Wales, with a further 100 arriving on Friday evening, moving water, moving equipment, moving people, taking the logistics off exhausted crews. On Wednesday, the 12th, the government had already convened a COBRA emergency meeting. By Friday, a new fire minister, Judith Blake, had been appointed in the middle of the crisis. Prime Minister Andy Burnham traveled to Stourbridge, stood in front of the burnt-out houses, and said Britain is a tinderbox right now, with 37 fires still smoldering around the country. Quick question for you while we are here, and I read these. Have you ever had to leave your home with only a few minutes to decide what to take? Fire, flood, quake, storm, anywhere in the world. Tell me where you were and what you grabbed, because that decision is the most human part of every disaster we cover, and I want to hear it. Here is the deeper reason this hit so hard. And it is not about weather at all. It is about how the country is built. In the parts of the world that expect fire, the landscape is designed with fire in mind. Fire breaks, cleared defensible space around buildings, fuel reduction burning, building codes that assume embers will arrive. Britain has almost none of that, because for a century it never needed any of it. Duncan Moss, who co-chairs a national group advising the British government on wildfire, described the problem precisely. The homes now identified as at risk sit inside a patchwork landscape, generally without the managed fire breaks that are standard in other parts of the world. Ordnance Survey data suggests over 1 million people in Britain live in landscapes that can carry fire. Their houses back directly onto fields, commons, heath, embankments. There is no buffer, because nobody ever thought a buffer would be necessary. The fire services face the mirror image of the same problem. British fire and rescue services were designed, trained, equipped, and funded to fight fires inside buildings, and they are extremely good at it. Structural firefighting means heavy protective kit, breathing apparatus, a hydrant, and a fire that stays inside 4 walls. Wildfire is the opposite discipline. It moves across open ground, it can run for days, it needs light kit, off-road vehicles, blowers, beaters, aerial support and endurance, and it drains far more people for far longer per incident. British services have been building that capability, some of them seriously so, but they are building it while the fires are already arriving. There is a precedent, and it is recent enough that many of the same firefighters were there. In July 2022, on the day Britain first passed 40 degrees, wildfires destroyed homes in Wennington and Dagenham on the eastern edge of London and in Ash Hill in Norfolk. Wennington was the image that shocked the country. A grass fire spread across about 40 hectares, roughly 100 acres, and damaged 17 houses in a single afternoon. Before that day, it was considered close to impossible for a British wildfire to destroy homes. Fire scientists have been direct about what it means that it has now happened again at a larger scale 4 years later. Seeing wildfires destroying homes for a second time is a signal that the country is experiencing more extreme fire behavior than it has historically, driven by a combination of exceptional heat and prolonged dryness that makes fires spread faster and burn harder. So now let me give you the honest calibration, because you are going to see thumbnails this week claiming Britain is burning like Spain, and that claim is false. Britain has not experienced anything close to the devastation that has hit southern Europe this year. In Spain, roughly 150,000 hectares have burned, 6 times the area lost by the same point last year. A single fire in the Avila area became the largest in Spain's recorded history. Fires near Madrid merged into a front officials described as beyond the capacity of firefighters to contain, and tens of thousands of people were evacuated. A fire in Almeria killed 14 people. France has passed about 115,000 hectares for the year, a national record, with the Gironde fire alone burning around 42,000 hectares. Across Europe as a whole, more than 560,000 hectares had burned by the 12th of August. Set Britain's roughly 24,600 hectares against Spain's 150,000, and the difference is obvious. In burned area, Britain is somewhere near a sixth of Spain and a small fraction of the European total. There has been no British mass casualty fire, no British evacuation of tens of thousands. That is the truth. And saying it out loud does not weaken the story. It sharpens it. Because the alarming British number was never the acreage. It was the count, the speed, and the capability gap. A country with no fire breaks, no fire-adapted building stock, no cultural memory of fire, and a fire service built for a different kind of emergency has just recorded more wildfire starts than in any year in its history before the middle of August, while officials say the season may extend to November. That is not Spain's problem arriving in Britain. It is a different problem, on an island where nothing was designed for it. And I will admit something. I have read a lot of eyewitness accounts this year, from Spain, from Greece, from California. The line that stopped me was the British one. A man standing in an ordinary garden, behind an ordinary railway line, watching trees detonate, because it came from a place where that sentence should not be possible. The government's response reflects that same shock. Along with the emergency alert and the military deployment, ministers imposed a temporary nationwide ban on the sale of disposable barbecues. The official advice states that during current drought and heat wave conditions, these products cannot be considered a safe product and must not be sold in stores or online for now. Downing Street says the guidance is under review. The Prime Minister told the BBC that some of the fires burning across the country will have been started by them. The senior minister who signed off the phone alert, Louise Hay, called it the most extensive use of the United Kingdom's emergency alert system in response to an active incident. Which brings up the sharpest objection to all of this, and it deserves a straight answer rather than a dismissal. Plenty of people in Britain reacted to that siren with irritation. There is no fire on my street, so why is my phone screaming? Isn't this the boy who cried wolf? Won't people switch these alerts off so that when a genuine life-threatening emergency comes, nobody hears it? That concern is legitimate, and alert fatigue is a real, measured phenomenon. But look at what the alert actually asked for. It did not tell anyone to evacuate. It asked people not to light disposable barbecues, fire pits, garden incinerators, or fireworks, and to call the emergency number the moment they saw flames. In a country where a large share of ignitions come from human behavior and where fire services were already turning down requests for support because they had nothing left to send, the cheapest intervention available is not more fire engines. It is fewer ignitions. The alert was aimed at the only variable the public directly controls: That is also the honest limit of what anyone can say about cause here. Climate does not light fires. People and accidents light fires. What a drying climate does is decide what happens in the 60 seconds after a spark lands. In an average British summer, most sparks land on damp ground and die. This summer, an unusual number of them land in a landscape that has been drying since spring, and each one has a chance of becoming a major incident that it would never have had in 1980 or 2000. There is one more cost in this story that will not appear in any damage estimate, and it will outlast the headlines by years. British lowland heath, the kind burning in the New Forest, is rarer than tropical rainforest. It supports reptiles, ground-nesting birds, and insects that live almost nowhere else in the country, and much of it is legally protected as internationally important habitat. A fast summer fire through dry heath does not simply remove the plants above ground. It burns into the peaty surface layer, kills the seed bank, and takes the invertebrates that everything else eats. Conservation groups have warned that recovery on some of these sites will be measured in years, not seasons, and that certain species face long-term disruption to habitat that has nowhere else to go. And if you live anywhere near open ground that has gone brown this summer, whether that is in England, Wales, Southern Europe, Australia, or the American West, the practical lesson from Stourbridge is small and unglamorous. Houses in these fires mostly ignite from embers, not from a flame front. That means the highest value hour you can spend is clearing what is closest to the building. Dead leaves out of the gutters, dry material away from the walls and off the decking. Nothing flammable stacked against the fence line. Keep the route out of your street in your head, not on your phone. People in Stourbridge had minutes, and the ones who had already thought about it lost less. So what should you actually watch now? Watch the rain, and watch it skeptically. Forecasters have been cautious for good reason. A cold front brought fresher air over the weekend, and there is a chance of rain reaching northern areas early in the new week, but the Met Office has been clear that the largest amounts are expected over Northern Ireland and Scotland, with little in the south, and ground this hard does not absorb sudden rain. The first serious downpour on baked soil tends to run straight off into rivers and drains, which is why droughts so often end with a flash flood rather than a recovery. If Britain gets a thunderstorm before it gets a steady soaking, the next headline may be "Water in the Wrong Place." Watch the weekly drought briefings from the Environment Agency, and specifically two lines in them: reservoir storage, which was at 69%, and the number of reservoirs classed as exceptionally low, which was 5. Those figures decide whether restrictions widen through autumn and whether next spring starts from a deficit. Watch the fire count. Officials expect the season to run toward November. The record that mattered in this story was never the temperature, and it has not stopped moving. And watch what Britain decides to build. Fire breaks around the settlements identified as at risk. Equipment and staffing for services that were designed for a different century of fire. Whether the disposable barbecue ban stays temporary or becomes permanent. Whether new houses on the edges of dry commons get any defensible space at all. Those decisions will be made in the next few months, in a country that has just been told by 19 burnt homes in the West Midlands that its assumptions expired. The Randermwen fire in Wales was still being fought this weekend. The New Forest was still smoldering. The next serious rain, if the current forecasts hold, will not reach most of the ground that needs it. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because we will be tracking exactly this over the coming days. The next Environment Agency drought update, whether that rain reaches southern England or slides north, and whether the British fire count keeps climbing into September. On an island that spent a century believing it could not burn, the summer is not over yet.